Hi, in this video I'm going to discuss how people believe in things when there is little or no evidence to do so. Sometimes there is evidence of a kind, but nothing that can be called good or reliable. I have deliberately chosen to look at three topics that may seem unrelated, but in fact distinct parallels can be drawn between the three. The three topics are the tooth fairy, flat earth and God. I'm only focusing on the Christian God at this time, mainly because that is the area that I'm more familiar with. However, these theories that I discuss can be applied to other religions. My own conversion from believer to atheist came about purely because of a lack of evidence in a supreme being. I arrived at this decision without any influence from books or people. I've covered my journey from believer to atheist in another video that I'll link just here. When I was a child, my parents told me that when I lost a tooth, if I put it under my pillow, then the tooth fairy would visit at night and leave me some money. When I woke in the morning, the money had magically appeared. I had no reason to doubt the existence of a tooth fairy. Firstly, my parents had told me that this was true, and we are genetically programmed to believe what our parents tell us. It is just a survival mechanism. Secondly, there was concrete evidence in the form of the money that I'd found under my pillow. I don't remember how or when I stopped believing, but it probably had something to do with about the time when teeth stopped falling out of my head. It's fair to say that I quite literally grew out of believing. If you're interested, I've included a link below in the comments to the history of the myth of the tooth fairy. At the end of the day, this is just a harmless story told to children, and even sometimes includes a bonus payment for a healthy tooth. However, if an adult believed this story, it would be fair to say that they were behaving in a delusional way. The definition of a delusion is a false belief or impression. The story is only about 100 years old and is accepted as a fiction. But if I was to write this story down and publish that story, that wouldn't then make this story a fact. It wouldn't constitute evidence. A more modern phenomenon is a resurgence of a group of people who believe that the earth is flat. Now, if you're not aware of these theories, I've put a link below to somebody called Professor Dave, who does a very good job of explaining the theories and debunking them. Thousands of years ago, when we only had observations to go by, it is understandable that people could think that the earth was flat and at the centre of the universe. As early as 5 BC, Greek philosophers had the concept of a spherical earth. Over the preceding centuries, the flat earth idea came and went, mostly driven by religious creationists. And yet now, through a comprehensive system of experimentation and observations, scientists have developed the heliocentric model that accurately predicts the mechanics of the solar system. There is no doubt that we live on a spherical earth. So where does this band of flat earthers come from? It must be said that the main culprit is YouTube. There are a group of people who watch these YouTube videos and believe what is being presented. When I was teaching primary school children, I often used this website to teach the children to be skeptical about what they found on the internet. The Tree Octopus website was made to look convincing as a hoax, but can be used for the purpose of highlighting how things that are false can be presented in a realistic way. Flat earth believers have some pseudoscience explanations that to somebody who is not in full possession of the facts could sound convincing. One such claim is that the vacuum of space should suck the atmosphere away and that therefore a dome must exist over the earth to prevent that from happening. They have no evidence for the existence of this dome. Vacuums in fact don't suck, and the atmosphere is held to the earth by the force of gravity. But because there is a gap in their scientific knowledge, they fill that gap with some kind of pseudoscience to justify their stance. Other claims, such as Antarctica being an ice wall that surrounds the flat disk, are based on a belief that it just exists, and there is no evidence for this either. The model that they present cannot be used to predict the mechanics of the solar system, such as night and day, the seasons and lunar eclipses. So this to me starts to sound very similar to the tooth fairy scenario again. Somebody on YouTube makes some claim that seems to be backed up with some evidence. The viewer decides that they believe this evidence and then decides to spread the word on their own YouTube channel. The difference is though that these are not children that are believing this fiction. These are adults that are choosing to go against millennia of reliable scientific data. What would these people make of the Tree Octopus website, I wonder? I totally agree with people being skeptical and asking questions, but when people reach a conclusion, they must do so based on all the evidence that is available. Despite a group of adults believing that something is true, this does not constitute evidence. Most people would agree with me that the tooth fairy and flat earth are not real. But you may have noticed while I was talking about these topics that there were distinct parallels that can be drawn to religion. The bottom line is that there is no evidence for a God. There are many arguments for the existence of a God, but none of these are actually evidence. All of these arguments rely on an element of faith or fallacy to a greater or lesser degree. Faith is defined as a firm belief, especially without logical proof, and a fallacy is a mistaken belief based on an unsound argument. My parents told me that God exists, but this doesn't make it so. In the same way that the tooth fairy exists, just because a large group of children believe it, it is not evidence for the existence of a God just because a large group of people share the belief. The stories written down in the Bible were often written down, often centuries after the supposed events had taken place. The Bible is a jumbled collection of stories which contains many contradictions. The God of the Old Testament is a thoroughly dislikable character, and the New Testament has been rewritten and mistranslated many times over the centuries and therefore can't be deemed as reliable. There are Gospels that were written that have been deemed to be non-canonical and do not appear. Therefore, the clergy have decided to leave out some Gospels based on whether they like them or don't like them, and again this severely reduces the believability of this document. When religious people have a problem that they don't understand, they solve it by trying to insert a God into the gap. I find it quite interesting that religion from 200 years ago is very different from religion today. As science advances, the gaps in our knowledge decrease, and therefore the gap that a God must fill also has to shrink as well. Just because at this point we do have gaps in our scientific knowledge, that is not evidence for God, and we shouldn't automatically just fill them in with a supreme being. And finally, just because somebody believes that God exists doesn't constitute evidence. All that this does prove is that person has a faith. God, to believers, is like the ice wall to flat earthers. Neither have seen it, experienced it, or have any evidence for it, but nevertheless believe it is there all the same. In future videos, I'm going to cover the arguments for religion, but I hope that this video has given you something to think about. Be happy and comfortable with yourself. Bye for now.